Hello, dear students. I guess all of you are safe at home during this time of pandemic. Because of the lockdown, we are unable to reach out to you personally. And this is one effort that we are making from SJPUC to keep you academically oriented by posting you study material and few videos. And we shall also have a few live classes very soon. So we shall be beginning our biology syllabus of second year with the first unit, reproduction, and the first chapter, reproduction in organisms. So happy learning. Stay safe. God bless you all. Now students, let us begin with the first lesson, reproduction in organisms. We all know what the word reproduction means. It's nothing but giving rise to young ones, or perpetuation of young ones of its kind, of its own species. Why? To continue with the species. Like for example, cats give birth to cats, or dogs give birth to dogs, humans give birth to humans, amoeba gives birth to amoeba, or gives rise to amoeba. All this is nothing but reproduction taking place in order to continue the species. Now let's move on to what is lifespan. Like I mentioned now, every organism has a birth, and after a certain period of time, this organism dies. So birth and death are also characteristic features of every living organism. Now this time that is there between the birth and the death, this is time span is what is called as the lifespan. We can define lifespan as the period between birth and natural death. You get that? The period between birth and natural death. Because organisms can die because of accidents, because of natural calamities, because of diseases. Okay, but that time period from birth to that kind of a death is not lifespan. When there is natural death, then we call this time period between the birth to natural death as lifespan. So different organisms have different lifespans. Like for example, a parrot has a lifespan of 25 years. An elephant may have 100 years. Human beings have 100 years. Dogs have around 20 years. Okay, this is what we call as lifespan. Now let's move on to modes of reproduction. What are the two ways in which organisms reproduce? Organisms reproduce in two ways. What is that? A sexual method and sexual method of reproduction. Now what's the difference between asexual method and sexual method of reproduction? You know, you have studied this last year in your first PUC and also in your school days. Okay, asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is a type of reproduction where there is no formation of and fusion of gametes. Okay, there's no formation and fusion of gametes. So if a reproduction does not involve gametes or fusion of gametes, that is what we call as male sex cell sperm and female sex cell ovum. In that case, such type of reproduction is called asexual reproduction. So there is no formation and fusion of gametes, and it's one parent that is involved in reproduction which gives rise to the young ones of its kind. Whereas in sexual reproduction, we know that in sexual reproduction there is formation of gametes. The male sex cells are called sperms and the female sex cells are called ova, and they undergo fusion to form a zygote, a single cell called zygote, and that develops into an organism, and in that case we call it as sexual reproduction. It could be one parent involved if it's a bisexual organism where both male and female reproductive organs are present in the same organism. Okay, we call it as bisexual or hermaphrodite in animals. And if it's a unisexual organism, the male one will produce the sperms and the female will produce the ova, and fusion of the gametes will result in formation of zygote. Definitely, sexual reproduction has an advantage over asexual reproduction, mainly because there is genetic variation that is brought about in the zygote because of the union of the nuclear material of two different organisms, okay, or two different cells, right? So you know what exactly now are the differences between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Now let's go to the details of asexual reproduction. The details of asexual reproduction. Now we all know asexual reproduction is a type of reproduction where there is no formation or fusion of gametes. A single parent is involved in giving rise to the organisms, and hence we call this type of reproduction as asexual reproduction. Now let's move on to the offsprings. How are the offsprings that are formed because of asexual reproduction? You notice that these offsprings are morphologically, that is in appearance, as well as genetically. What is that? In the type of genetic material that they have, the genetic genes that they have, they resemble each other. All right, they resemble each other, and hence because these offsprings resemble each other morphologically and genetically, how are they derived? From one parent without the fusion of gametes. All right, so they will also be similar to the parents. So you notice these morphologically and genetically similar individuals, we call them as clones. What do you call them? Clones. So how do you define clones? Clones are defined as morphologically and genetically similar individuals. How are they formed? By asexual reproduction, right? Okay, now that you know what are clones, let's go on to what are the different ways in which organisms reproduce under asexual reproduction. For this, let us just view a few examples, check a few examples to find out what are the different types of asexual reproduction. Now let's look at this. This is a picture of amoeba, a single-celled organism. And you know that this amoeba is a protozoan. It has a single cell and there's no cell wall. And amoeba also undergoes reproduction like any other organism to give rise to daughter cells. But in case of amoeba, the single celled, cell as you notice here, divides. First, the nucleus divides, then the cytoplasm divides, and finally, it gives rise to two cells. These two cells, we call them as daughter cells. Now, what do you call this type of division? Asexual reproduction, where a single organism without formation of gametes is giving rise to two daughter cells, which are its offsprings now. We call this as binary fission. We call this as binary fission. Binary fission refers to a single cell which divides into two to form two cells. This is what happens under favorable conditions in case of amoeba. And this is a type of cell division, I can say. All right. Different from mitosis and meiosis because this does not involve spindle formation, but it's a type of cell division. All right. Let's move on to the second example. The second example that we have here is that of a yeast. Now what is this yeast? Yeast is a single-celled fungus, a unicellular organism. The yeast also, okay, multiplies by asexual reproduction. What type of asexual reproduction is this? You notice here that in case of yeast, there's a small outgrowth that is formed on the cell, the single cell, a mature cell, and finally it grows like a bud. Once it grows like a bud, the nucleus divides first, and then the bud pinches off from the mother cell to form a new daughter cell. What is this called? Budding. This is called budding in case of yeast. All right. So cell division, that is binary fission, what you call in amoeba, and in yeast, what you call as budding, are also a sexual type of reproduction. Now let's go to organism that you notice here. All of you recognize it, isn't it? It's a Hydra. And Hydra, you know, belongs to coelenterata. What are coelentrates? Coelentrates are multicellular organisms with tissue grade of organization. You have studied details of coelentrates last year. Now I am taking an example of Hydra here. Why? Because Hydra exhibits here a type of reproduction called asexual reproduction. No wonder it also undergoes sexual reproduction. But now let's consider how the Hydra undergoes asexual reproduction. Just like yeast, you notice in Hydra, a small bud appears from the mother Hydra, or rather a single organism. Alright, and from there you notice the bud grows slowly. It still remains attached to the parent, and once it grows, okay, develops tentacles and complete tissue organization happens. You notice that it pinches off from the mother body or the parent body and lives an independent life. What is this called? Again, in Hydra, it's called budding. This is in Hydra, it's called budding. Let's move to the next organism. The next organism that we are taking example from here is a sponge. Sponges are poriferans. You're aware of that, right? And these sponges, they also reproduce by sexual as well as asexual method. But the asexual method that you notice here, which the sponges, undergo, are formation of internal buds. These internal buds in sponges, what do you call them? You call them gemmules. You call them gemmules. Okay, these are internal buds which are found inside the body of the sponge, and then they are released out, and then they lead a independent life. Let's move on to the next organism. We are studying different ways in which these simple organisms, okay, they undergo reproduction. So we will summarize all this once again, but just have a quick glance, okay, at all these organisms and how do they undergo asexual reproduction, their mode of asexual reproduction. Now the next organism that you have here is a algae. A green algae here called Chlamydomonas. Now let's remember it as a algae. Now in algae, which are again, this is a unicellular algae, you notice here that in this particular organism, there are motile spores formed. You notice the flagella in these spores, isn't it? So these flagella are used for locomotion. All right. These motile spores are released from the body. All right. From a mature cell. And what are these called? These are called zoospores. Motile, that's why they're able to move like an animal with the help of the flagellum. That is why we call them as zoospores. So what is our sexually reproducing body in algae? It's zoospores. Let's go to the next one. The next one is a fungus. All right. Fungi have a body which is called mycelium, made up of units called hyphae. Now this is a fungus called penicillium, all right, from which we get penicillin. And in penicillium, you notice a sexual reproduction. How do these undergo a sexual reproduction? By forming small units of spores which bud off from the parent body. You notice here spores being formed and released. What do you call these spores or a sexually reproducing bodies in penicillium. We call them as conidia. What do you call them? Conidia. Right? So all these examples that you studied just now, all these are examples of simple organisms which are undergoing asexual reproduction. That tells us that complex organisms, plants and animals, undergo only sexual reproduction, whereas simpler organisms, algae, fungi, unicellular or even simpler multicellular organisms with cellular grade of organization, like in case of sponges, or tissue grade of organization, like in case of Hydra, all of them undergo a sexual reproduction. So we have a sexual reproduction in amoeba, what you call as binary fission, budding in case of yeast, budding in case of coelenterates, right? Budding or Hydra, and then again budding in case of sponges, but these are special buds. They are internal buds. What are they called? Gemmules. And then you have the unicellular algae, okay, like chlamydomonas, which produce motile spores, what we call as zoospores. And then you have fungi like penicillium, in which you notice asexually reproducing bodies which pinch off from a mass of cytoplasm and nucleus, which pinch off from the parent body. We call them as conidia, right? So these are the different ways in which organisms or simpler organisms reproduce asexually. Now that you know about the examples, okay, various examples, and the sexually reproducing bodies of various organisms, all right, please try to remember them. It's important. Let's go on to how exactly asexual reproduction takes place in higher plants. Okay, you were just now telling that higher plants and animals undergo sexual reproduction, and you're telling us now that higher plants also undergo a sexual reproduction. Now let's see what is this asexual reproduction that these higher plants undergo. Now we call this as vegetative propagation. What do you call it? Vegetative propagation. What is vegetative propagation? Vegetative propagation is nothing but asexual reproduction in higher plants, where you notice, okay, that the units, it could be it's nothing but the vegetative parts of these plants, like a stem, a leaf, all right. These actually give rise to new organisms. Usually, in case of higher plants like angiosperms, you notice here that the flowers are the sexually reproducing structures, and that these plants produce, and sexual reproduction occurs through that. Okay, even in case of lower plants, like in case of gymnosperms, gametes are produced. Okay, but in case of higher plants like angiosperms itself, you also notice that they undergo something called as vegetative propagation. It's nothing but asexual reproduction. We call that as vegetative propagation. And these vegetative parts, okay, like it could be a stem, it could be a leaf, all right, these, when they give rise to a new plant. Now this is vegetative propagation, but what are these units called? We call them as vegetative propagules. What do you call them? Vegetative propagules. All right, are you clear with that? Let us now take examples for these various types of vegetative propagules that you notice in case of higher plants. We have an example now. Let's go through it. We have an example now here of potato. Potato, a very familiar vegetable to all of us. Now you notice when you keep potato in a moist condition, you notice some plants, young plants growing from this potato at different regions on the potato from different points. All right. Now potato is a modified stem. It's a modified underground stem. Okay. Now this modified underground stem, which are nothing but the branches of the stem, which is above the ground. They grow into the soil and they swell up because of the storage of food. So this modified underground branches of the stem, we call it as tuber. It's swollen because of the storage of food and water. It is one way of overcoming unfavorable conditions, okay, by storing food and water. So even when the aerial plants die, if there are conditions are adverse, still this particular modified stem with stored food and water survives under the ground. And when conditions are favorable at various regions, you know that stem has nodes and internodes, okay, at various regions, from the nodal regions, you notice new plants will arise. The buds will give rise to new plants, aerial shoot. Okay, so this is nothing but vegetative propagation, because a stem, a modified stem, underground stem, is giving rise to a new plant. So we can call this as vegetative propagation, and tuber as a vegetative propagule. Same way, you have another example here. You know what this plant is? It's ginger, right? And you have studied this as a modified stem in your first year class. Now, ginger is also a modified stem, just like potato. It's also an underground stem, right? And the same reason for overcoming adverse conditions. Now, it's swollen because of storage of food and water, and it grows horizontally under the ground. Now, even a ginger, all right, when conditions are favorable in natural condition, when conditions become favorable, when it's adverse conditions, it's in the form of this stem under the ground. When conditions become favorable, it gives rise to aerial plants from the buds which are present at its nodes, right? So what can I call the stem as? This modified stem is a vegetative propagule. You have a name for it. What is it called? It's called as a rhizome of ginger, right? It's a branched stem, you can notice, and it grows horizontally. All right, so this is an example for vegetative propagation. We have a third example here for vegetative propagation. What is that? It's bryophyllum. Bryophyllum, unlike a tuber and rhizome, that is modified stem, here it has modified leaves. Bryophyllum, you notice, is a succulent plant, okay, and the leaf of this plant, at its margins, it bears buds, and these buds are called leaf buds. When this leaf falls onto the ground, the leaf buds, when they come into contact with the soil, each bud emerges into a new plant. This is the way these plants reproduce, okay, asexually, right? So what are these called? Leaf buds in bryophyllum. Let's go to the next example. Agave. Agave is a plant again which undergoes asexual reproduction by forming small bulb-like structures. When these bulb-like structures fall onto the ground, each one will develop into a new plant. So what is this called? Bulbil. Why? Because it's very small bulb-like structure. It's called as a bulbil, and agave produces lots of bulbils, which when they fall to the ground also produce new plants. Okay, so this is another example of vegetative propagation. We'll come to the last example that we have to study under vegetative propagation. What is that? It's eichhornia. Eichhornia is also called water hyacinth. It's found in the freshwater lakes and ponds, etc. And you know, it takes away all the oxygen and finally kills the other plants and animals that are there in the pond. Okay, it's a weed. It's known for its beautiful flowers. But this eichhornia, no wonder it reproduces sexually by producing gametes. But at the same time, you know, it reproduces asexually by forming offsets. What are offsets? You notice, if this is one plant, from its nodal region, okay, a branch of the stem develops, and after running to a short distance, this branch of the stem, what is called as the offset, again gives rise to aerial shoot and root system below it. Okay, the root, it is a floating hydrophyte. The aerial part of the plant is above the ground, whereas the root which help in buoyancy as well as absorption of nutrients. They are below the uh, below the water level, and this is above the water level. What do you call this? This is called as the offset of eichornia. You can see here. So very quickly the plant grows by using this vegetative propagation method. Vegetative propagation is the easiest way in which these organisms can reproduce and produce large number of offsprings. Okay, so that's vegetative propagation, a type of asexual reproduction. So I hope you have followed what exactly is asexual reproduction, the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, and various ways in which asexual reproduction occurs. It will quickly summarize what we studied today, okay, so that you remember the examples and all the points that we studied today. So what did we study today? We studied what exactly is lifespan. What is it? The time period between birth and natural death. We call it as lifespan. Then we studied what are clones. Clones are individuals, organisms which are morphologically and genetically similar. They are a product of asexual reproduction. Then we studied what is asexual reproduction and what is sexual reproduction, the difference. In asexual reproduction, there is no formation of gametes, no fusion of gametes, and only one parent gives rise to the offsprings. Alright, so that's asexual reproduction. Meanwhile, we also studied under sexual reproduction that it involves formation of gametes and fusion of gametes. Okay, so usually it's two parents, a male and a female, which give rise to the sex cells, the gametes, what we call as the sperms and ova, whose fusion will result in the formation of a zygote, and it gives rise to a new organism. Then concentrating on asexual reproduction, finding out the different ways in which organisms reproduce by asexual reproduction, we studied examples. What are the examples we studied under asexual reproduction? We studied amoeba, which is a single-celled organism which undergoes binary fission, right? And then we studied yeast, which is a unicellular fungus whose asexually reproducing structure is a bud. So it undergoes reproduction by budding. Then we studied Hydra, which also undergoes budding. So its asexually reproducing structure is a bud, just like that of yeast. Then comes the sponges, which also show budding, but these are internal buds and we call them as gemmules. Alright, we call them as gemmules. Then we studied something about green algae. Alright, algae, which is a unicellular algae. How does it reproduce? Motile spores called zoospores. And then we studied about a fungus called penicillium, which reproduces by forming a sexually reproducing spores called conidia. Produces conidia. Right? These are the examples you studied in lower organisms. Then coming to the higher organisms, we studied a way in which the higher plants undergo asexual reproduction. What is that called? We called it as vegetative propagation. Right? And what are the units of the plants which bring about vegetative propagation called? We call these units as vegetative propagules, isn't it? And what are the examples you studied for different ways in which vegetative propagation occurs? Tuber, a modified stem in potato. Rhizome, a modified underground stem in ginger. And then a leaf bud. In which plant? Yes, bryofilm, right? And then we also studied bulbils in agave, and finally offset. All right, as again a modified stem in case of cornea. Right? So these are all ways in which a sexual reproduction occurs. So in the next class, we will talk about sexual reproduction. Kindly go through the textbook, or there's online NCRT textbook available. Just check and prepare yourself. Well, these are the basics of biology that you're going to study in second year. So kindly go through it once again, and in case you have any doubts, clarification, you can write down the questions and keep. Definitely we'll be able to help you sometime later. Thank you for your patient listening. I hope you have understood today's topic well. Thank you again.